Well, hello again, ethics students. Welcome back to class number 12. This is Friday, April 17th, 2020. Or at least it's the class for that day. It's not actually that day yet. Now, we left off at the point considering abortion where we were almost to the point of considering Judith Jarvis Thomson's widely read article. One point just before we get into her article somewhat. And this is a point actually in the previous day's class notes. It was number 25. Sometimes it is considered to be the case that the being in the womb is what it is depending upon what you want it to be. And so the question then arises, as we've discussed, when does a human being become a person? Right? If you don't want it to be a person while it's in the womb, you're probably not going to refer to the being as a child or a baby. If you do want to give birth, if you do want to have a child, you probably will refer to it as a child or a baby. So the question becomes, when does a being become a person? At conception, sometime after conception but before birth, at birth, right after birth, a day, a week, a month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. When do you draw the line? So this is where we take up Thomson. And she starts at in her article at the very beginning on page 334, she starts by admitting that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to draw a line in the development of a fetus. Now, if you were to skip to the very end of her article, she would say that certainly if we're talking about a very early abortion, she does not consider that to be the killing of a person. And so she's not really dealing with that. She's dealing with something beyond the very early stage, whatever the very early stage might happen to be. But she sees the difficulty for real that honest voluntarists like Peter Singer and certainly the classical realists see that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to draw a line before birth. And it's even, in the case of Singer and many others, impossible, if not difficult, to draw a line after birth. So Thomson, pardon me, Thomson takes up the argument and she proposes an analogy. Her analogy that she uses is the analogy of the violinist. She goes through this on page 335. Now, it's not necessary for us to read through the whole thing word by word. That's what you're supposed to do on your own. But basically, the idea is you wake up in the morning, and during the middle of the night sometime, the Society of Music Lovers has plugged in this famous violinist to you, and only if the violinist remains plugged into you will he or she be able to live. And of course you object, what am I doing? I have to stay in bed now for 9 months because I've got this famous violinist plugged into me. And the Society of Music Lovers says, well, it's only for 9 months. And the problem is if you unplug, then the famous violinist is going to die. And they say, as the point is made here at the bottom of 335, granted, you've got a right to decide what to do with your body, but, they say, this famous violinist's right to live outweighs the right that you have to do whatever you want with your own body. Now, whenever an analogy of any sort in any situation is proposed, the first thing that we always look at is whether or not it's a good analogy. And so we're hoping that the strong points of the analogy will be the relatively important points, and that the weak points will be the relatively unimportant points. So we want to make sure that if that's the case, we want to see how that works in the analogy of this famous violinist. Well, there are a couple of things to consider, right? The first question is unplugging what's happening in an abortion? That's essentially what's happened here in the analogy. The violinist has needed your blood system or whatever, and they've, by technological advancement, plugged this violinist in so that he or she can use your blood system until his own recovers. Is abortion merely unplugging, right? Or what's really happening there? We know it's some sort of procedure of removal. We don't need to go into any gory details, but we know that sometimes, depending upon when in the process of development, when in the process of pregnancy the abortion takes place, that it may involve more complicated procedures, and it may involve more dangerous procedures, and it may involve dismemberment and so forth, right? What if, in the analogy that is being proposed here, the person who's plugged in doesn't just propose to unplug from the violinist, but rather says, well, I'm going to hire somebody to come in and cut up the violinist and kill the violinist, not just unplug them. So that's one question that arises with regard to the analogy. Is abortion merely an unplugging sort of operation? Another element, there are several elements, but another element is that the violinist is a stranger, right? And even if, right, and this example is geared toward the example of pregnancy resulting from rape, even if pregnancy results from rape, the individual who is within the womb is not a complete stranger, in the sense that the violinist is a complete stranger. So there's a difference there as well. Regardless, as gruesome as it might be, or as unfortunate and as sad as it might be, the product of rape is in fact still the product of an individual's